Because if Africa is going to participate in the AI revolution, we have to have our own computer on the continent. They said, yeah, that's very nice, but actually, who is going to buy it? This is a new asset class. We don't understand it. Why don't you build it first with equity capital? And then when you have proven that you have built it, when you have got all the contracts and the off-takers, then we will come and we can give you the money. We had to do that. Okay. Thankfully, we're in a position where we have a strong crop of shareholders, and we're able to raise the money and build the infrastructure. But what if we didn't? Is the only compute facility that's available on African soil at scale today. It means that we would be sitting here today talking about the plans to build AI compute. It wouldn't be there. So we took the risk, we have built it, but it doesn't take away the fact that we built it expensively. We built it at a price point that makes us less competitive when compared to other AI factories in other regions. So really fundamentally, the core thing that we need to solve is how do we bring well-priced patient capital, preferably capital that we mobilize locally from our own pension funds.
Agnes, the first point, what Hardy started with was the openness of governments, but also on the side of governments. Can they get into really untested waters? Because when you're looking at the innovation that is coming, everything is new. Governments also need to take time to learn, figure it out themselves, get to know how best to balance it. So on the side of governments, how best can we approach innovations and not limiting the private sector, not limiting the benefits that we could be getting out of them?
So that's a great question, and I think it questions the role of our policymakers and how they understand, in fact, a quite complex framework. You were mentioning how we have a generation of ICT ministers who get it, they understand it. I think they have also been exposed to a broader set of digitalization and what that means, which makes them more in tune with what we're discussing. Now, I want to maybe highlight a number of other questions, a number of other themes that I think are around this question of digitalization. Because, in fact, from a technological point of view, we probably already have the answer. We know how to build the stack. We actually even know how to choose the architectural design that ensure sovereignty and maintain the control by the government. But there are other things that are around this, which is the governance of the data, which is how you establish a complete legal framework so that people actually feel like that they can go on board, feel like they can confide in the fact that they would provide their data to somebody that they believe is a custodian and will take care of that data. We have just committed a white paper that I would encourage you to read on how digital identity is the infrastructure that changes everything. You can find it on the website of INGRU. What we find is that there is an absolute correlation between the countries that we call nascent in the field of DPI, in the field of digital public infrastructure. There's a correlation that is almost 100% between their policies around trust and governance of data and their status in the growth and development of how they are journeying on that path of evolving towards DPI. And so for our policymakers, thinking very acutely of DPIs as, of course, a technological question, but not only, right? As a very large and broad topic that embarks the question of government and the question of how the relationship to people's data is imperative. The other dimension is probably the notion of leadership. I think it's about understanding that, as we were referring to earlier, there is a new era, and you actually need to be not faint at heart. You need to be absolutely resilient, intentional about doing it, and going beyond the electoral cycle, and making sure that whether wind or rain or thunder, there actually is a vision around these topics and that maintains. And so that is, of course, a challenge for a political cycle.
Indeed, a big challenge. Emmanuel, the side of artificial intelligence, data, as one of the points that Agnes has also mentioned, an area that the government really focus on. Can we say that, can Africa realistically talk about artificial intelligence sovereignty without having its own data pipelines, without even looking at having the compute infrastructures in place? How can we navigate that?
Well, it's actually a very good question, and I'm glad that Hardy is sitting on our panel, because Cassava Technology is one of those African example and success stories, how the founder and his entire team can come together, believe in the continent, and build something so incredible, and also then attract an investment from NVIDIA of a lot of money to build compute. So there's this part. I think from an OpenAI perspective, we are quite a nascent company, right? When did ChatGPT launch? In 2022. I joined the company to lead Africa about 1 year and 2 months ago. But from our perspective, I would say any talks around sovereignty need to involve collaboration. So from a company perspective, we've launched 2 initiatives, which actually has established that kind of framework, how to engage with governments, namely OpenAI for countries and OpenAI for education. For the education part, we work with ministers of education where we sit down and we learn. So what is that your country need? How can our products support your country and your educational goals? I think countries like Estonia is a good example because they've been working with our teams. We have the cohort, and we've also started a conversation with several African governments in that context, so it's quite encouraging. And also in terms of OpenAI for countries, this is actually how we work with countries together, how to build a sovereign AI infrastructure. So from a company perspective, I think collaboration is key. So when we talk about sovereignty, when we talk about data, the government is obviously a very important and big stakeholder, and we are happy to work with any government. And I think a good example is also we launched a project with the Gates Foundation, H1000, which is supporting primary healthcare facilities. And we are launching in Rwanda first, and we've been meeting the government, speaking about the benefits of our services, of our products. But the government is actually the one major stakeholder in control here. So these 2 examples. And again, big up to Cassava, who've actually been doing the groundwork here.
And as you say, OpenAI is relatively new, but when you're looking at artificial intelligence, it's only as strong and powerful as the infrastructure beneath it. And can you say that Africa is trying to adapt AI faster than it is actually building the right infrastructure?
No, very good question. That I cannot necessarily say. I would probably need to have the data to do so. But I would say I wouldn't even say that it surprised me, because before I started this role, I was told that, oh, AI is this thing of the future when it involves Africa. And it is so not true, right? I've mentioned the Codex Ambassador program that we've launched. If you see the enthusiasm, how the Codex meetup are happening in Nairobi, we had the first one, and we're having the second one on Saturday. These are the builders of the future, right? I think it's great to talk about what you obviously mentioned, the sovereignty and whether Africa is picking up on the race. But if you speak to these young developers who are actually leveraging our technology, even beyond our product and beyond our company, this is incredible. And I wish many, many more people would actually see this and go to the tech hubs, speak to the developers, and see that the kind of magic that they are doing.
Yeah, and Linda, as Emmanuel has said, the enthusiasm is there across the continent. But is it reflecting when you're looking at investments coming in, the money coming in? And what are some of the risks, or what are some of the fears that you'd say investors still have when it comes to BOT or even PPPs within this space here on the continent?
I think the biggest issue is really starting with the regulation and the policies, right? And I think Agnes touched on it a little bit, that you need to have regulation and policy that survives change in regime. And in many cases, that's not the case. You have everybody wanting to override what the previous government has done. So how do we make sure that the policies and regulations that we have in place stand the test of time? And how do we make sure that they also evolve? Because technology is evolving, so you can't actually have static technology. So I think it's very comforting to hear Hadi say that the ministers that are currently, in place right now understand technology. So I think you can actually have a sensible conversation in terms of what are the policies and regulations that make sense. I think, we have the advantage also of we're not first in the market in this regard, so we can learn from the others and not make the same mistakes that other regulators have made. I mean, we see, crypto regulation coming up right now. When it comes to our turn, I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. I think we can actually perfect what's actually out there. So I think regulation, in my view, is the biggest issue. And if I look at the Ethiopia Telecom as an example, the starting point of that project, which was a World Bank Group facilitated project, was really on the regulation and the policy. We had to make sure that that foundation was concrete. The next thing is the structure of the project. Now, a lot of projects come to market as PPPs, or the structure is being sold as one thing, but it's actually another thing. The sharing of the risk, the allocation of the risk is important. Who's bearing what risk? And so when governments are putting or inviting investors to come to market, or even investors, such as Howdy, are coming to the likes of IFC asking for financing, it's about making sure that the risk allocation makes sense. Should I be taking the risk of who's going to be consuming the compute? No, that's not the risk that the private sector should be taking. So, if I extrapolate the example that Hadi was using, I would say that, probably the question that one was asking was, who is going to be, the off-takers of the compute? And if you're able to put a credible line of those, those parties, yes. And I'm probably thinking that, when you came to us, it was very early, and perhaps, finance can also take a little bit more risk as well. I think, the structure of the project is super important, and ensuring that, the agreements that we put in place also have to be dynamic and solid. In a lot of cases, I think you find, especially when you're working with the government, and I don't mean to beat up on government, but there are cases where the capacity is not there. So you need to make sure that whatever agreements are being put on the table are actually bankable. Bankable from many different respects, from a legal perspective, from a technical perspective, and so on. And this is where, obviously, from an IFC perspective and a World Bank Group perspective, in the PPP world, we come in terms of advisory.
Yeah, and still on you, Linda, from your experience, even when you're engaging with different governments, would you say, where would you say we are currently? And in terms of even governments being able to structure, whether it's PPPs that are able to attract long-term capital, are we there yet? Are we still navigating the waters?
I think we can do a lot more. We're certainly doing more than, I think I've been in this business for more than 20 years. So we're certainly doing a lot more than when I started, but I do think that we can go a lot faster. I'm not an expert in the technology or the digital side, but I hear quite a lot about, subsea cables that have landed that are not being, pushed into the, or being optimized internally. And the question for me is, such a waste. Such a waste. If Google, Amazon, and all these, Facebook are bringing in the subsea cables, we should be ready to receive and transmit them. And I think part of the problem is that government is not ready and has not figured out how do we actually get companies to come in and, do the last mile. We're not there. And I think this is where, when you've got first movers like, cassava, which you have to give credit, but we need a lot more of the cassavas, and we need regulation that allows a lot more of the cassavas to come in, because you can't have private sector participation when the regulation prohibits private sector providing certain services or private sector doing certain things. And I think the regulation needs to catch up very fast.
Then, Agnes, how best, or how can even governments be able to maintain sovereignty of citizen data when the systems are being designed as well as operated externally?
So my take on this is that there's there's a fundamental difference between the control and the ownership and the making. Well, and when we consider the build, operate, transfer, indeed, you might be tempted to say, okay, because the private partner builds that, then there will be leakages and it might elapse from the control of the government. I do not believe that. I think it very much lies into how the infrastructure is thought through, how it is architected, And there are many ways for a government to actually maintain control. There are a couple of areas that are no-fly zones, right? So if I take the area of the identity, you want to have the identity register that belongs to the state. You do not want that to be handed over to a private sector partner. You want to have the authority that regulates it to remain within the space of the government. You also want to have the government or the agency, that the authority, let's say, that's in charge of thinking the architecture, to have that control and that ownership. And then the private sector can provide the technological know-how, the capability, the experience of having done these things, because it takes know-how. You know, it takes, in fact, multiple years and multiple trials and errors to actually be able to build up such infrastructure. If I take an example, we know that across the world there are, you know, about 20-25%, if not even more. We think about half of the world now has actually developed digital public infrastructures at scale. And so that experience was not seamless. If you think of the Indian Aadhaar experience, it took them 25 years to get to where they are today, right? And today we're starting to see the value of those infrastructures start to unleash. So India announced, for example, that more than close to a billion people were onboarded with their data health, and that they can seamlessly go into hospitals that are connected to the system, and their data follows them. But it took them 25 years to get there. And to be able to build that, it takes knowledge and know-how. And so governments should be able to leverage that and not to reinvent. And so to be able to do that, you know, everybody should play their part. The structure, the ownership of the infrastructure, and the choice as to whether you choose open source, whether you choose proprietary data, should remain with the government. And then the private sector should do their part, whether it's financing, whether it's bringing know-how and ability. And I believe it's in that contribution, mutual alliance, that would actually find the value.
And I'm going to ask one more question to Heidi, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the conversation we're having. What would you say has killed models when you're looking at even as from an investor perspective? Is it the lack of regulation, right? Regulation, or is it uncertainty when it even comes to attracting revenues?
Look, there's no one size fits all. You know, I mean, one of the things that we have to disabuse, particularly our international partners, you know, Africa is not one country, right? So what happens in Egypt